They are both similar, COVID, pandemic, and climate change, in so much as the government response to both is to keep the fossil fuel constant growth economy going and to signal to the market to keep investing in fossil fuels.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Climate Emergency Forum. My name is Regina Valdez, and I'm joined today, as always, with Paul Beckwith and Dr. Peter Carter. Today's discussion, COVID, climate change connections. So you may be wondering, what does COVID, which is a virus, have to do with climate change? Well, quite a lot. But I'm going to give you a broad overview of some of the things that we're seeing happening globally and how this will affect our response to climate change. So, first, let's look at some of the broad patterns that we see happening around the world. One of the things that COVID-19 has done has exposed and, in some cases, widened social fissures. This is very important when we're talking about our approach to climate change. And if you're wondering, what do these social fissures, what do you mean? Well, we saw that in Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro was much like our president here in the United States, who really played down the severity of this disease. And at first, India really responded quite well. And well, let's just say India responded very swiftly with a shutdown that was to take effect after it was announced within hours. But now Narendra Modi has allowed people to attend vast rallies where thousands of people are unmasked, and those numbers are going up precipitously. So, what has happened with this is it has also underscored the vast disparities in healthcare access and infrastructure. There have been two explosions, I believe, in India, and tremendous lack of oxygen supplies that have left others gasping for breath and often, too often, dying. And it's also highlighted weaknesses in international coordination. So, how, one wonders, are we to address something so complicated as climate change if we can't even agree on whether or not we should wear masks or whether or not COVID is simply a flu and it'll all just one day go away, as President Trump famously said? The containment efforts have been here and there, and the response has fueled partisanship. And there's just so many different opinions on how to respond, much like the opinions on how to respond to climate change. Well, here in this country where I'm living, the United States, there are still many, many people who don't even believe that there's such a thing as climate change. Or for those who just can't deny it anymore, well, they say that it's not anthropogenic. It's something that happens all the time. It's nothing new under the sun. But we know, and we want you to know, that what's happening is very new and it is certainly human caused. The approach to solving the problems of climate change demand a united approach. But we see that even with this disease, that can't happen. Unfortunately, economic um, inequality has increased under this lockdown. It's not affected everyone equally. And those who have computers and reliable internet were able to work from the comfort of their homes, whereas those who don't have such luxuries have not been able to work, and many, many millions of students who don't have access to a laptop or even a cell phone have fallen way behind in their classes. So, how in the world are we to educate people about the dangers of climate change and how to approach them? How in the world are we going to encourage international cooperation where those very organizations that we used to hold in high esteem, such as the World Health Organization and the United Nations, are now under a shadow of mistrust? These are deep, deep challenges we face. And I'd like to turn to Dr. Peter Carter to hear what he has to say on this and other challenges such as climate change.
Thank you, Regina, for posing the many challenges. Um, so in one word, the situation is, have we learned any lessons from the COVID pandemic? We could have learned important lessons. We could still be learning important lessons, but the main lessons are not good ones at all. At the beginning, I think the media was pretty good. They linked climate change with species disturbance, habitat disturbance, and deforestation. That was a good thing. And the media really helped, of course, in alerting and alarming the population of all the countries. That's important. So I just want to mention again that I was quite startled actually a few years ago when I read from the infectious disease experts who are working on climate change, that they said that the vast majority of infectious and communicable diseases will be increased by global warming and climate disruption, and we will see novel diseases. And COVID-19 is such a novel, new, we've never seen it before, and it's produced this massive pandemic, first wave, second wave, third wave. It's pretty darn serious. COVID and climate change has already, as was easily predictable, hit the most vulnerable most severely. And millions and millions and millions of people are facing the most terrible famines. The government, and I'm going to focus here on the governments and the policy, the government COVID response, in fact, in my view, means a world of constantly increasing disaster for the future of the entire population. That's the inevitable result of the government non-policy on climate disruption and the government-specific policies and actions on the COVID, post-COVID recovery. They are both similar, COVID, pandemic, and climate change, in so much as the government response to both is to keep the fossil fuel constant growth economy going and to signal to the market to keep investing in fossil fuels. The response, of course, is very different, but they have the same effect. The COVID emergency response was impressive from the beginning. The big gaps that Regina mentioned, that we should certainly learn about. And of course, it was absolutely unprecedented. It's interesting, and it was good, that there were universal, certainly to begin with, drastic measures. There were financial measures. There was constant data made available to the public, constant every day. And there was a promotion, even encouraged by the threat of legislation, for very great public behavior change, huge change, lockdowns, stay where you are, and those came and went, which is very significant. And on the whole, I think, I'm speaking from British Columbia, on the whole, I think the public responded pretty well to these big, drastic advisories from their governments. But today, our governments have committed and already starting money into the fossil fuel industry on the pretext of the economic recovery. 318 billion US dollars are going to the fossil fuel industry. That's 11% more than the clean energy investment. So this has happened despite universal calls from all of the organizations, NGO, intergovernmental organizations, including the IEA, the International Energy Agency, to make this recovery a recovery for clean energy, not to put it to continue to promote more and more and more fossil fuels. And so this government action, which by the way comes on the heels of the biggest fossil fuel subsidy in 2019, was the last report. This is clearly the crime of all time, and it is a most terrible, evil thing to do.
Thank you so much for that, Peter. It seems like climate change, much like this virus, has these positive feedback loops. So it's really quite analogous, and it's an apt discussion for us to be having now. And I really liked your question. What have we learned? Have we learned our lesson? It's sad to say, but I have to question that. And one of the things about humanity, and me being one of them, we seem to have a hard time learning our lesson. And just one more thing I'd like to add is we're having increasing migration into the cities. With increased urbanization, there's increased human proximity. We're living in veritable petri dishes. It's frightening. Paul, what do you have to say about this?
Yes. So unfortunately, as many people have said, we don't have vaccines for abrupt climate change, right? So people have put a lot of hope in the vaccines for eliminating, eventually eliminating the coronavirus, COVID-19. One of the biggest parallels, I think, is climate change is a problem with outdoor air, right? It's the greenhouse gas concentrations in the air outside, which are rising, trapping more heat, causing all of these problems. And because of the loss of Arctic coldness, we're getting really wavy jet streams and extreme weather events, and they're going to hit our global food supply very, very soon. With COVID, it's more immediate, right? Not much more immediate, but it's happening, it suddenly hit us and we all have to react. We have to lock down societies, et cetera. The problem is the silos of the health and the environmental engineers and the physics people and the people that understand aerosol science, because from day one, COVID, and we should have known this, is an airborne transmitted disease. It turns out transmission from surfaces is very, very minimal. And yet you can remember all of the uproar a year ago about cleaning your groceries when you bring them in and cleaning every surface and washing your hands 20 times a day. As the Spanish flu was 100 years ago, COVID is an airborne disease. And I call it an indoor disease because if you're outside, minuscule air currents keep you relatively safe. If you're a couple of meters away from other people outside, you're not going to get the disease. All the contact tracing studies showed that it's minimally spread outside. If you cough on somebody outside, yes, they can get it. But if you stay away from people, it's almost non-existent transmission outside. It's an indoor disease. Now, it took us a long time to start wearing masks in indoor public spaces, but finally that was regulated. But we can do a lot more than just wear masks inside. We need to monitor the indoor air quality because COVID is an indoor air quality disease. So we need proper ventilation with the outside. We need to make indoor environments as closely to, as similar as possible to outdoor environments. So to do that, we need good air exchange with all indoor environments. Now, how do we measure that? How do we know if it's sufficient? There's a very, very simple and powerful method which connects climate change to coronavirus, the indoor disease, and that is measuring the carbon dioxide levels. So outside, we were about 280 parts per million CO2 at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Recently, we've passed 420 parts per million. If you're indoors and the CO2 level is not much higher than the outdoor level, say it's less than 2 times higher, there's reasonable ventilation in that indoor environment, that public space, and you're okay. The risk of catching coronavirus, COVID, from somebody in that space is relatively low. if the CO2 level in that indoor space, if there's not good ventilation, the CO2 level can go to 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 parts per million in a matter of an hour or two. And the room feels very stuffy. Any virus particles in that situation, whether you're wearing a mask or not, you can catch the virus. You can get a high viral load. So I'm calling on governments everywhere, and I've spoken to Canada's Minister of Infrastructure to put CO2 monitors in all public spaces and have an alarm. And if the level goes above about 700 or 800 parts per million, an alarm goes off. People have to leave the room, even wearing their masks, or they have to open windows or turn on the ventilation system. They have to do something to reduce the risk. So I think that's the biggest connection. Also, of course, the obvious spin-off is people will become aware of the CO2 level. If every member of the public is aware of the CO2 level inside and outside, they will be able to see it increasing year over year outside, and then be more concerned and aware about climate change. So it's perfect to have CO2 monitors everywhere and let the public know what those numbers mean.
I love that idea, Paul. Here in New York City, we have a clock in Times Square that calculates the national debt, and it just keeps going and going, and people are aware of it. And I think the idea of having a CO2 clock in many, many places would do so much, and especially just to let people know the relationship between CO2 and climate change. One of the things I love that you called this an indoor disease. And I will confess, I'm going to confess right now to being a naysayer, not that it's an indoor disease. I agree with you. And according to the Green Building Council, we humans spend approximately 90% of our lived lives indoors. So, but this is kind of take me back to this whole thing of what has been highlighted by COVID, which is a separation between the haves and the have-nots, because I believe that your idea, which is an amazing one, can certainly be affected in Canada, US, Europe, but places like India, my God. When I was there in Varanasi, when I came back, my lungs hurt for 2 weeks, literally, speaking of air quality. And so it's kind of interesting to me how this will all play out in terms of infrastructure. Peter?
I'm going to mention something, Regina, that was absolutely crucially important for us to be able to survive what is now, and we are inevitable climate catastrophe. We're now in catastrophic climate change, and you said the world must unify. Yeah, that is if there's one key, it's that the world must unify, cooperate, throw all their resources into stopping accelerating climate change and ocean acidification. I also want to refer to something that Paul said, which is also so important. And this is something that Paul has been saying for a number of years. We are in abrupt climate change. It is so obvious to Paul and myself and other people. However, I'm afraid our scientific institutions are letting us down on that one, because they are still discussing how to define abrupt. And we are in abrupt climate change, and we've been in an abrupt situation like COVID, okay? It's very, very much like COVID. COVID obviously was abrupt. But to those of us who follow the data on 10,000 years, 2,000 years, 1,000 years, or a couple of hundred years, climate change is absolutely abrupt. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's abrupt and it's overwhelming. So, Paul, is there a way we can be less overwhelmed with all of this abruptness?
Yes, well, one of the points is, with these indoor monitors, use a little laser and a little dispersal mechanism and a little detector, and they can be built very, very inexpensively. And I see that they will become standard measurement devices that are built within iPhones, within all the smartphones, for example, within maybe some appliances that people have in their houses. If you could buy, a device in your house, there might be a CO2 monitor because they're especially important in, kitchens, for example. If you have natural gas burners for your stove, the air quality can get very poor, and eventually expand above measuring just the CO2, but also measuring the particulate matter. I think that the price of these things could drop to just a few bucks a unit, and they can be ubiquitous. They can be everywhere, and that will really give the public a good sort of understanding. Okay, the CO2 level is such and such, and it's continuing to rise, and we have to actually have carbon dioxide removal methods and solar radiation management methods and slash fossil fuels. And when we measure things, when there's a visible number, then we can tend to take action on it more rather than just on a concept. Now, an interesting report, which I'll do separate videos on my YouTube channel and post on paulbeckwith.net, is the US National Intelligence Council has a group called the Strategic Futures Group, and they came up with a report called Global Trends 2040. And I'm told that a lot of my climate input went into this report. So this is a report, it comes out every 4 years, I believe. And they try to make a projection of what the globe will be like in 2040. So they look at they call the structural forces, the health, the environment, the economy, technology improvements, and then the dynamics to societies, individual societies, states, and on the international level. And they have 5 scenarios. And it's interesting because the report just came out a few days last week. They have one of the scenarios involves global food shortages in 2030, causing catastrophe around the world, and then countries kind of starting to work together more to rebuild and stuff. Now, they say that these scenarios are given with great humility because none of us can have a crystal ball, and we can't know exactly what's going to happen. And when things start to happen, there's lots of feedbacks, and there's human agency, human response to change things. I mean, just recently, Biden announced about a half reduction of emissions by 2030, and so did Trudeau, close to that, 45%. So, but with Trudeau, Canada has yet to meet one of its targets in climate. I mean, you can have a bit of hope that these things happen, that they actually get serious about it. But as Peter said, the subsidies on fossil fuels is the biggest thing that has to go. And COVID became an excuse, the economic recovery, as Peter said, to put 318 billion US towards the fossil fuel industry. And it's just insane. It's very hard for a logical thinking person to accept that this craziness is still going on in the world. I mean, we're stewards to a dying planet, and we're not bystanders. We're actually causing things to get much worse and worse and worse with all of our actions. So COVID has pointed out that our society is really not that resilient. Okay, the manufacturing sort of last minute stuff being shipped around the world, the way that the large internet companies, the Amazons, get wealthier and wealthier and wealthier. So money goes to the billionaires. They've made bucket loads of money in the last year, while people real people are suffering, not able to get jobs, losing their jobs, trying to put food on the table, worried about living in their cramped quarters, worried about getting the infection and so on. And meanwhile, the stock market marches up to record levels. Like, it's very, very disheartening, very, very illogical. And we're not going to make it if we just continue what we're doing. We're toast. We're going to be finished. Okay. There's lots of things that we cannot avoid, like global food shortages. So how will we deal with that? We need huge wake-up calls. I was hoping the virus would be a huge wake-up call, But there are glimmers, you know, I always say we need the US military budget and military budgets of other countries around the world to actually start looking at how do we go to a renewable energy society? How do we how do we ensure that that we have some, how do we get stability? How do we stabilize the climate? What do we need to do? So we need, whether it be new organizations set up or, you know, certainly education on the climate change risks, you know, in starting at very young level, you know, all the way up through the education system. Kids they get hardly any information right now from their teachers on climate change, next to nothing. Right. So we need to restructure our society because the environment is restructuring us and it's taking us down, and we have no time left. We have to start doing things logically, or we're out. We're going to be out like the dinosaurs.
Paul, you said so much in that final statement of yours, and yeah, I mean, just the idea. I love this phrase, you know, that we're stewards to a dying planet. Is this really just hard to swallow, isn't it? And it's all so sad, and so didn't have to be. Um, the subsidies for the fossil fuel industries, if people just need to know where their taxpayer dollars are going and how they're contributing to ecocide, to death of hundreds, thousands of species. I also want to just do a quick plug along with you, Paul, to the global trends. That report is worthy reading. I especially love, that report is worthy reading. And they did state in there that climate change was going to swiftly accelerate beginning 2030. So we all need to be prepared for what's coming. But to end on a more positive note, if such is possible, we must remain hopeful. Remember Dr. Peter Carter, we must remain hopeful. For without hope, we don't have that energy to do what we need to do to save this planet and every living being on it. So we want to thank you for doing your part, and that is tuning into yet another climate emergency forum. And if you want to go a step beyond what you've already done, which I humbly ask you to do, go ahead and hit that subscribe and click on the bell. When you click on the bell, you'll know as soon as a new video is out. And we want to keep up with you and have you keep up with us. So thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you on the next Climate Emergency Forum. Thank you.